Baldur's Gate 3 is a game of Dungeons & Dragons ran by an amateur dungeon master. That might sound like a hot take, but if you bear with me, I'll try and explain what Larian's Baldur's Gate 3 does wrong in its interpretation of the D&D 5e system, and why I've said what I have. First, I should preface all of this with the following. I haven't ever finished Baldur's Gate 1 or 2. That's for two reasons. First, both are sort of before my time. Both games released at the tail end of the 90s and at the start of the early 2000s. And I was 6 years old when Baldur's Gate 2 released in Europe. As I grew older and began to fall in love with RPGs, the titles were known to me, but their age was a major factor in me not playing them. By the time I did finally sit down to try them at about 16 years old, I knew I didn't like the style of isometric RPG they were. It's the combat is the thing. I know that behind the scenes in them, it's not really real time. I know that things are calculated in an order or whatever, and you can pause the action if need be, but it's the lack of that actual turn-based combat the tabletop RPGs have that was a huge issue for me. I've only ever played one true isometric RPG in that style from start to finish, and that would be Planescape Torment. I only did that because, well, its rating is so uniquely excellent that I believed it to be the single best written video game in history until the release of Disco Elysium last year. So that's my personal history with the franchise of video games, but what about Dungeons & Dragons itself? Well, I actually started with Pathfinder because that just so happened to be the system my first ever DM ran. Since that game, I've dipped in and out of other systems. 4e was the big D&D release for most of my life, and then 5e came out and that hooked me. See, D&D isn't just for us nerds or us geeks, it isn't for a niche subject anymore. It's cool to play D&D now. So a modern D&D system has to be flexible and accessible, and 5e is that system. I love 5th edition. I think it's homebrew friendly, it's easy for players to pick up, but it contains a level of depth for advanced players and DMs that make it capable of maintaining play over long campaigns. I've written multiple homebrew settings of my own in 5th edition, and I've played in as many games. So Baldur's Gate 3 is entering the scene in early access at a time when Dungeons & Dragons isn't just for us number-crunching losers anymore. It's got a mainstream appeal. Across a gamut of geek culture, that means it's going to draw a bigger crowd than it would have otherwise. Which makes it a damn shame that it does so many little things wrong that take away from it all. Okay, let me bullet point the things Baldur's Gate 3 does wrong first, before I examine them in depth. First, it messes with the 5e balance via spell changes that interact with Larian's own introduced systems in a way that's detrimental to player experience, but also creates concern for experiences at higher levels. Second, Larian's own systems, such as surface effects, fire, acid, etc., become the norm in combat, and damage calculation for them isn't even done correctly in the context of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. Third, combat encounters are stacked, often feeling though a TPK is the intended outcome every single time, and that makes for an exhausting session, where you want to avoid combat if possible. Fourth, avoiding combat doesn't grant experience, making the last point worse. And fifth, game's handling of checks is amateurish in the context of Dungeons & Dragons, and on occasion outright impedes the feeling of success one gets from a good roll in a non-combat encounter. Okay, so those are our points. Let's break them down. So this is points 1 and 2 together, as they are so intertwined it would be difficult to separate them. Cantrips in 5th edition are actually pretty good spells. Most of them scale at higher levels in a way that makes them continuously decent damage dealers for small-time enemies, and being cantrips, they don't use spell slots, meaning they remain useful throughout a session or over a single in-game day. For the purposes of examining how Baldur's Gate 3 ruins that, we'll be examining Firebolt. In 5e, on the tabletop, Firebolt is a one-action, 120 feet cantrip that deals 1d10 damage on a hit, scaling at 5th, 11th, and 17th level. This is all Firebolt does. It can ignite flammable surfaces, and I'm not about to say that every DM ignores that concept. Some DMs will be very strict about the application of fire to materials, but I'd hazard a guess that most don't. Raging fires every time you cast a cantrip or single target fire spell would be a nuisance to both players and the DM's NPCs in combat. So to clarify, Firebolt is essentially no different than an arrow or crossbow bolt. It deals fire damage, yes, but it will not create an AoE or surface of fire, and it won't cause lingering fire damage over time. In Baldur's Gate 3, it does all of those things. In the game, this is the worst case scenario. In Baldur's Gate 3, a firebolt in the game deals 1d6 damage. Let's say enemy hits you for the maximum damage. You take all 6, but the spell also creates a single surface of flame at the character's feet. You take the maximum 4 damage for being in that fire immediately on the enemy's turn. You've now taken 10 damage from one cantrip. It is now your character's turn, and they take the maximum of another 4 damage for starting their turn in fire. They also take another 4 to run out of it. Without crits, this cantrip has dealt 18 damage, and all before the character struck has had a chance to take an action. To clarify, if you stand in fire in the tabletop, you take damage at the end of the turn if you're still in it. You don't take damage from moving through it. This kind of thing is consistent throughout Baldur's Gate 3. Ray of Frost has frozen blood pools, knocking all of my melee characters prone as it becomes ice, leaving enemies unhindered. Every enemy either throws acid or fire vials, or shoots arrows that do the same, or is a spellcaster, who by the way, all ignore spell slots. These changes to the 5e balance are consistently in the way in every combat encounter in the game. The only time it didn't happen was fighting some gnolls at one point, and that's only because they're animals. Even the spiders shoot acid every 2 seconds. This raises concerns for the higher level experience. Is Fireball going to create a 20-foot area of fire I have to wade through, taking damage all the time? Yes, the spell in the tabletop is a 20-foot sphere, but it doesn't say that it creates an AoE of lingering fire damage. There are very, very specific spells in 5e that do that sort of thing, and Larian deciding arbitrarily that all elemental spells should do this is hindering the experience. Why bring a melee character at all if they're going to take nearly 20 damage from a cantrip at level 2? What are stronger spells going to do? The solution, of course, is this is easy. Just stop messing with spells. As the abundance of surface effects and difficult or damaging terrain, enemies need to throw less shit at you. Every goblin in this game is like going up against Tucker's kobolds. Every single one. Again, I think the solution is simple. Just for the love of God, stop. Stop making them throw shit at me. Okay, while we're on combat, and this may be subjective, but every enemy in this game, bar a few, is stacked. Going up against 5+ goblin archers, all with fire arrows or acid vials, is bad enough, but when all 5 of them have 20 HP or more, it becomes a nightmare. Now throw in the problems I've mentioned above, a bugbear with 50 HP, and the fact that they all ignore spell slots, and combat is brutal. If you look at the DM, Larian is actively trying to TPK me in every encounter. I get that some fights should be tough, but this is unreal. Any good DM knows not every combat encounter needs to be hard. Maybe you're just trying to slow the party down, make them waste spells, or even just annoy them. Regardless of the intention, nearly every fight in Baldur's Gate 3 feels like a mini-boss encounter. And that's ignoring the actual boss encounters. Some of those seem fair in comparison. At least there's only one bad guy to engage with. Bouncing off that point to the next one, it makes combat tiring. I want to avoid it as much as possible. Which makes everything harder because we aren't rewarded for our efforts. Avoiding combat often nets you no experience at all, turning optimal gameplay into murder hobo grainfest, which is exhausting because, as I mentioned, combat is stacked against you in every single sense. Finally, and this one is less serious but I thought it worth mentioning, the game's moments of skill checks or saving throws are usually fine, but on occasion utterly ridiculous. This one requires some clarification for non-DMs, so bear with me. When making a skill check for players, either ahead of time or in the moment, it is better practice to make players roll one time at a higher threshold, or DC, than ask for multiple rolls. There are a couple of reasons for this. First, it rewards players for their efforts more often, which is something you should be eager to do as a DM. Second, players will enjoy beating one DC 17 check more than 3 DC 10s, and third, it's just fair. Insisting on multiple rolls over and over smacks, correctly or not, of a dungeon master who is fishing for the outcome he or she wants over the player's satisfaction. Baldur's Gate 3 didn't do this a lot, but it did happen. You would be asked to make a roll and succeed, and then make another roll and succeed, and then another roll and succeed, and finally achieve the outcome that you'd initially set out to do. You would make you would make at least 2 occasions, 2 further identical or different rolls to achieve an outcome that should have been handled with the first. That is amateurish DMing. Just make the initial DC higher and reward the success. I don't think that Larian is doing this to punish us. I think they're doing it to build tension, and it doesn't work. Rather than reward success, Baldur's Gate 3 is punishing it. And that's actually it. Those are actually my largest issues with early access right now. There's a lot of good and some minor personal bads that I have. I don't like Forgotten Realms as one, but that's entirely subjective. Game looks fantastic when its textures load. I really like the opening hook on the Illithid Nautiloid, and the voice acting and writing so far have been excellent. It's been great to see my favourite system realised in this format. Just wish it wasn't held back by the issues I've mentioned. That's it. Video's over. If you're seeing this from somewhere other than your subfeed and you're new, hello. Feel free to subscribe if you want. I'll probably cover Baldur's Gate 3 more as early access continues, but there may also be something else on the channel you like. Feel free to have a look. Anyway, video's over. I'm done. I'm going to go play more Baldur's Gate 3 now and try out some of the other classes and see how I feel. And I'll see you in the next one.